Welcome to Feeling Seen, the podcast about the movies that make us feel seen. Today, my co-host is a veteran film director, screenwriter, and producer. It's the singular Paul W.S. Anderson. Paul has directed some of the most iconic films of the 90s, the British crime drama Shopping, the film adaptation Mortal Kombat, and the infinitely terrifying, my scariest movie of all time personally, Event Horizon. He is also responsible for the epic collision between video games and cinema, directing and producing the Resident Evil series, on top of that Mortal Kombat movie, with 6 films spanning Res Evil, nearly 15-year run alongside his wife and frequent collaborator, Milla Jovovich. It is also, we have to shout out the power and impact of Milla Jovovich within the greater landscape of the female action cinema history. That makes Paul W.S. Anderson a huge part of that story, which is near and dear to my heart. Paul's most recent film brings to life the work of author George R.R. Martin. It is not Game of Thrones. It is called In the Lost Lands, and it is in theaters right now. The film stars Jovovich alongside Dave Bautista as a witch and a hunter who journey into a dangerous landscape in search of an ancient artifact. Paul joins Feeling Seen to talk about In the Lost Lands, his early years as a British director in Hollywood, and the persistent fanfare surrounding Resident Evil. Plus, we get into the 1985 coming-of-age film, very importantly, St. Elmo's Fire. The passion burns deep. My God, the extensive filmography of my favorite Paul Anderson director in Hollywood, Paul W.S. Anderson. What else do the people need to know about you before we get started?
I'm here and I'm very excited.
Well, thank you so much for being here. We truly appreciate you taking the time.
It's my pleasure.
Tell us about the new work. Tell us about In the Lost Lands, another collab between you and Milla, and this time with Dave Bautista. Tell the folks at home about the new movie.
Well, it's all based on a story by the fabulous George R.R. Martin. And, Milla is a huge consumer of fantasy literature, and she loves all of George's work, had read all of George's work. And I got approached about 7 years, well, she got approached about 7 years ago by Konstantin Werner, our co-producing partner and screenwriter. And he had this short story that George had written, In the Lost Lands. And Milla kind of like clipped me over the back of the head with it and said, "This is amazing. We have to go make this." So 7 years later, here we are. You know, we spent a while developing it because we wanted to really please George, and obviously he's a great writer and a hard taskmaster. And we kind of built out the short story, and made the movie that I feel like is a very different looking movie for anything I've made before. Certainly, the way of making it was very different. And super excited to have it in theaters.
Now, I've read a bunch of you talking about the importance of place and location and your enjoyment with world building. And you look at you look at obviously the Resident Evil franchise, you look and just sort of over the body of your work. And even in Mortal Kombat, I love that is I still think it's at least top 3 in the video game adaptations list, which I literally maintain a list of for Vulture. So I'm really immersing myself in these things whenever they come out. How was the difference in the creation of this world compared to, I mean, you've done that so much in a sci-fi fantasy space, but how was this different for you? And was that like a learning curve kind of thing to do it a different way?
Well, I wanted to, I was very led by George's story. You know, it's, In the Lost Lands is about a witch and a hunter who go out into the Lost Lands in search of a werewolf. And I felt that George had written basically an adult fairy tale. And I love fairy tales, but I love the original fairy tales. I love the Hans Christian Andersen Little Mermaid where she dies at the end.
Right.
I love
more
the
of a
Brothers Grimm.
More of a Grimm's fairy tale guy.
You know, I don't, the Disney rounded off edges, I prefer the original kind of dark material. And that's certainly what George had written. And I'm thinking, what is going to be the world of this adult fairy tale? I need a kind of very distinct visual landscape for it. And also I'm very aware that I'm adapting George R.R. Martin. And, Westeros is already out there in people's consciousness, and it's a big deal, but how am I gonna build out the George R.R. Martin verse and add to that. I don't want to be reductive and I don't want to be copying. I can't just do Westeros again. I can't go to a forest in Ireland or a glacier in Iceland, because they've been there already and they've done that. And Westeros is amazing and it has its own feel. How are we gonna create the Lost Lands? Because it's in the title of the movie. It's really important.
Yeah.
And it's what the movie's all about. And these characters journey into this landscape and the way it affects them. And traditionally, I've always been led by location. I've tried to find like the most extreme place I can shoot. But it became very obvious to me that this land, this world that this adult fairy tale was set in, didn't exist. I couldn't
Right.
go to the derelict cement factory in Prague and go and shoot it, or the abandoned car park in Toronto. It needed to be something magical and something mysterious, because it is magical. In George's story, it's kind of like the Lost Lands is a little bit like the Overlook Hotel. You go into it and it's a whole world and it has an effect on the characters. So it occurred to me that we should build it from scratch, and we should build something that people hadn't seen before, so that we could differentiate ourselves from Westeros, but also give the audience an experience that they never had before, to see a world that they'd never seen before, because that's what George evokes in his writing. The Lost Lands felt like something you just hadn't seen before and hadn't experienced before. So that kind of led us to the idea of like creating the whole thing in a computer. But I didn't want to just shoot against a blue screen the way a lot of people do, where you shoot against a blue screen and then you create the background in post-production. But the actors don't really know what the landscape is, and the director of photography doesn't really know what the landscape is. So the performance doesn't really fit in with the background, and the lighting doesn't really fit in with the lighting in the background. So we ended up doing everything in reverse. Normally, where these landscapes are created in post-production, we created them in pre-production. We built them before we started shooting, and then we developed a system of live real-time compositing, which basically means that the actors could see exactly where they were. They could see themselves in the world, and that really helped them with their performances. Not that Milla and Dave don't have a lot of experience of kind of, being in front of a green screen and acting to a tennis ball that's eventually going to get replaced with some alien being. They've both done that. They're both really good at it. But, for example, the scene when they're in front of the fire fields, which is this huge lake of oil that has 500-foot high jets of flame, I can describe that. And, but words can only do so much.
Yeah.
But then on the day, I could show Milla and Dave, this is it. This is you standing on the edge of that black lake with the fire reflected in it. And it's beautiful and it's poetic and it has like an emotional impact. And as soon as the actors saw that, it altered the way they acted.
For sure.
Because the environment, has that kind of effect on the actors. And I was very conscious of that, and how sterile sometimes blue screen movies can be, because the actors feel disassociated from their environments. And, we really wanted to avoid that at all costs, to give the movie a super stylized look, but have the actors not have a super stylized experience shooting it. I wanted them to have a visceral reaction to the world that they were in. And this way of working allowed us to do that.
Well, I am so excited to talk about the movie that you brought, because it's a classic. There's so much to it, and it as like in its sort of content and presentation, it is not similar necessarily to what, I mean, I'm happy for you to draw any threads to the work people know you best for as a filmmaker, which is genre pieces, which is adaptation pieces, which is movies that look like you were given a lot more money to make them than I would imagine you were handed at times, and really upscaling in that way. But it is from one of my favorite director stylists of all time, and Joel Schumacher. And that is St. Elmo's Fire. And so tell me what it was that pulled the thread in you for St. Elmo's Fire.
I grew up in England, obviously, and from a very young age, I knew I wanted to make movies. I had this epiphany when I was a kid. They would have Saturday morning picture shows, which is where your parents would drop you off in a cinema with 200 other kids. And then your parents would just, because this was back those were back in the day when you could do that.
Yeah.
And the kids would just like run around like crazy and throw popcorn at one another and get into fights. And I think I was one of the few kids who was actually like watching the show. And they'd have some Laurel and Hardy shorts and some cartoons, and then they'd show a movie. And it would usually be like a Western. It'd be something that would be cheap for them to show. And I remember having this epiphany when I saw the credits at the end of the movie. It was a John Wayne Western, but I can't remember which one it was. But it was definitely John Wayne. And I realized that John Wayne wasn't a cowboy. Because when you're a kid, you think it's all just reality. You watch a movie and it's real. Elsa is real. Frozen, it's all real. John Wayne's just a cowboy, and you're following him around while he has this adventure.
Yeah.
And I saw the credits and I went, oh my God, this is like all made up. This is artifice. This is like pretend. This is make-believe. That's what I want to do with my life. But, having had that experience at a young age, I then realized, unfortunately, growing up in the north of England, nobody makes movies.
Sure.
And even if you move to London, they don't make the kind of movies that I was enjoying and liking.
Mm-hmm.
Because the British film industry at that point was very much, it was about art house cinema. It was about period cinema. If you wanted to see yourself as a young person represented on screen, the British film industry wasn't doing it for you.
Right.
If you wanted to see a movie about a sexually repressed English butler in the 1930s, we had loads. We had several movies a week for you.
I think it was in your interview with Vulture, you say, there was something I was keen to break away from, this notion of British cinema being so goddamn worthy and intellectual. And I would put that on a cross stitch, I believe.
Well, when I released my first movie in the UK, Shopping with Jude Law,
mm-hmm.
It got terrible reviews. The press hated it. And there was one review that said, this movie is nothing more than a reckless orgy of destruction. And I'm like, you say that like it's a bad thing.
I think that's my favorite subcategory of movie. What are you talking about? That's the section I'm going to at the video store.
We ended up putting that on the poster, actually, because I loved it so much. Because I'm like, we made it for no money. Do you know how difficult it is to have a reckless orgy of destruction on a really low budget? Normally, you can just have a couple of people talking in a kitchen. But, we did a reckless orgy of destruction on a tiny art house budget. But anyway, so getting back to St. Elmo's Fire, those American movies, I know Andrew McCarthy hates the Brat Pack label, but, that's what everyone talked about at the time. They meant a lot to me because, I think it was 1985.
Mm-hmm.
It was both The Breakfast Club and St. Elmo's Fire.
Same year. I know, it's insane.
And some of the same cast. But, I didn't have the American high school experience. And at that point, I was no longer a high schooler. But I appreciated the movie. And in many ways, you can say, I think most people would argue The Breakfast Club's a better movie than St. Elmo's Fire. But St. Elmo's Fire spoke to me because these were young people dealing with young people's situations, dealing with hangovers in the morning and struggles with work and struggles with relationships and giving a view of young people in a way that, my home cinema, British cinema, wasn't interested in.
It's true love, my friend.
Love. You know what love is? Love is an illusion created by lawyer types like yourself to perpetuate another illusion called marriage, to create the reality of divorce and the illusionary need for divorce lawyers.
You just can't deal with the little missus. Can I crash?
There are more people in law school right now than there are lawyers on the entire planet. Think about that.
You're just pissed off and bitter because you have not had sex in how long? What is it, a year, maybe 2 years? Refresh my memory, please, Kevin. Haven't you ever heard of the sexual revolution?
Who won, huh? Nobody. Used to be sex was the only free thing. No longer. Alimony, palimony, it's all financial. Love's an illusion.
It's the only illusion that counts, my friend.
Says who?
Anyone who's ever been in love.
Love sucks.
So does your attitude.
So it really spoke to me. And also, it helped that it had this great rock and roll soundtrack.
Oh, yeah.
Although the John Parr song, but obviously a lot of those movies use a lot of British acts.
Mm-hmm.
And that really kind of lit a fire underneath me as well, because I was watching, all of John Hughes' movies like Pretty in Pink and all of those films, using the psychedelic furs.
Mm-hmm.
They'd use Echo and the Bunnymen. They used all of this British talent. to sell these American youth movies. And I'm like, why is no one in the UK doing this? This is our music, but it's being used for American stories.
You're so right. The music is so inextricable from those movies, like marketing and pushing and the enduring legacy of their success. It is so wrapped up in the sound of them.
Yeah, and Simple Minds, Don't You Forget About Me. I mean, it was all, they were mining British talent. And that made me angry. And it kind of spurred me on as a filmmaker. And that's why my first movie, Shopping, has such an amazing soundtrack. So one of the ways we got the movie financed, actually, was we put together an amazing soundtrack, because it was easier to put together a group of great British bands than it was to raise money for a movie. So we kind of we had the great soundtrack, and then we were almost obligated to make the movie to sell the soundtrack. So we reverse engineered the whole thing. But St. Elmo's Fire, was another example of that. It was a rock and roll story told in a rock and roll way, with people that I could relate to, because they're all very, very handsome young movie stars, obviously. And, I was not a handsome young movie star, but everybody is they're the lead in their own movie, right? Everyone's the movie star in their own story. And, so I could empathize with these people. And it was just refreshing and exciting to see, young kids drinking beer and dealing with, yes, it was a bit soap opera-y. And yes, Joel Schumacher made it look amazing. Of course, everyone wishes their life looked that good.
Everybody wishes when they had their full-on crash-out breakdown that they were in a pink room surrounded by blue waving curtains as they sat crying on the ground.
We're all going through this. It's our time on the edge.
I'm just so tired, Billy. I never thought I'd be so tired at 22. I just don't even know who to be anymore.
Join the club.
Very melodramatic, very operatic, but very cinematic, and in my mind, as an aspiring filmmaker, I was walking around in my own movie, picturing myself in that movie and picturing the movies I would make. And St. Elmo's Fire was an important film for me.
And so this is 1985. So I would imagine you're about 20 at that time. Who is 20-year-old Paul W.S. Anderson? What is sort of your war on the world? Emilio Estevez's character is trying to project himself into any life that's going to get him this girl that thinks is going to make him the person he wants. And Andrew McCarthy doesn't believe in love, and he's writing a column at 22 years old called The Meaning of Life, which is the most 22 years old thing imaginable to do. Where are you in your on the fringes of becoming an adult?
I'm so McCarthy. It hurts. I'm so Andrew. And it was great. I actually worked with Andrew, and it was wonderful. I mean, it was a real thrill for me I did a TV movie with him that we shot in London, and it was a great experience. He's a great actor. Really, and I could tell he was going to become a great director as well, because he was so user-friendly and he knew so much. Technically, the guy was so sharp and on point. It's I was trying to direct him, and I'm I'm kind of wasting my time. You could just kind of come behind the camera and just do my job as well. And of course, eventually he did. I think a lot of those actors went through the mill, and it was unfair what happened to them, and the label that was put upon them, and the pressures that were put upon them. But Andrew kind of came through all of that, and with still a great enthusiasm for the industry that he works in. And I found that very, very, a very appealing aspect about him.
Now, this movie was like this and with The Breakfast Club in tandem. They really cemented that, quote unquote, the Brat Pack collective, and that like sensibility that I think became so much more. It seems so much more became tied to John Hughes in the movies than he would go on to make, than necessarily being a defining sensibility of Joel Schumacher, whose Batman movies I absolutely love. That movie was such a sensation here and kicked off a whole kind of like cultural era in the zeitgeist. How was it received over? Like, were you and all of your friends like pretty big fans of St. Elmo's Fire? Like, did it kick off over there the way that it did here, or was it more of a specialty interest?
No, it was a multiplex movie. As we called them back in the day, because there used to be a real schism between multiplex films that were destined to play in a multiplex for a mainstream audience and art house films, because back then there were art house chains, and you'd have your serious films, your British films about butlers, and in the art house chains, and then you'd have the multiplex films that were kind of looked down upon by the establishment and by the older press, by the kind of press that gave my first movie such a drubbing and called it a reckless orgy of destruction, because in a way they didn't really get that there was this surge in youth culture and movies for a young audience, made by a relatively young filmmakers. Certainly, it put a lot of bums on seats. People went to go see it. Not as many as in America, but America's obviously a much bigger place than the UK. But it wasn't as highly regarded because there was this kind of slight contempt for commerciality that still exists in the UK. It's one of the reasons why I live in LA.
Did you feel when you were starting out making movies with Shopping, and then I think Mortal Kombat came after Shopping, like your first American Hollywood picture, did you feel like when you were starting, like, all right, I've got to pick a path. I have to pick art house, even if it wasn't a hard decision, perhaps, I have to pick art house or I have to pick multiplex, because I'm going to be on a path for one or the other if I start down it. And I got to commit to that because there's not going to be a lot of room for fluidity in that. It sounds like it's a pretty big schism, the way you're talking about it, like in the film culture that you were growing up around.
I think the decision was kind of made for me very much because I was Shopping played at the Sundance Film Festival. We played, I think it was like the opening night. We weren't the opening night film, but we played on the first day, and we played on the last day. So I was in Sundance for the entire Sundance Film Festival, which was amazing. I'd never been to a place like that. I was like fresh from the UK, and but while I was there with Shopping, doing promotion and watching the screenings at Sundance, the movie came out in the UK, and the movie had been very delayed because the British Board of Film Classification, which gives you your rating, had refused to rate the movie for the longest time because they didn't like it. They thought it was a reckless orgy of destruction. And they didn't like it. They didn't want to give it a rating. They weren't allowed to not rate it, but they were allowed to not rate it for a while. So it just sat on the shelf for ages and ages and ages. And then when it finally did come out, the distributor who distributed it hated it. They thought it was you say you're in big trouble when your distributor doesn't like your movie, right? It's never gonna do that well. So it comes out in the UK and it gets the most catastrophically awful press. Like, Jude Law is too good looking to be an actor.
Okay.
The movie is a reckless orgy of destruction. Paul Anderson paints with bright primary colors like Luc Besson. All these things. All these things that
You're
were
really
meant
upselling this movie to me, British press.
All these things that were meant as deadly insults that I just didn't understand.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, the movie's playing in Sundance, and American movie executives are watching it, and they're loving it. Because what they're seeing is me painting in bright primary colors like a successful European director. They're seeing Jude Law, who's incredibly good looking and absolutely should be an actor. And they're seeing a reckless orgy of destruction delivered on a shoestring budget. And they're going, we could work with this guy. So it became very clear to me that I could either go back to the UK and never ever make another movie because people hated my movie so much, or I could chance my hand in LA where people seemed to get what I was doing. So I I went to LA, I kind of couch surfed, and that was the start of my career in America.
It's time for a break, but we will be right back with Paul W.S. Anderson. And then at the end, I will have one quick thing before we go about a show that is kind of burning it up in the discourse right now, Paradise, which is airing on Hulu, and it stars Sterling K. Brown, alongside many others, including the internally hunky James Marsden. So stick around if you, too, have been watching Paradise.
In 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
Put on your gecko shorts and grab your pogs. We're celebrating Max Fun Drive, 90s style.
Support the shows you love.
And get some rad retro-themed gifts.
Meetup day, bonus content, and more.
So don't miss it.
On the World Wide Web, March 17th.
Somewhere in an alternate universe where Hollywood is smarter.
And the Emmy nominees for Outstanding Comedy Series are Jetpackula, Airport Marriott, Thruple, Dear America, We've Seen You Naked, and Allah in the Family.
In our stupid universe, you can't see any of these shows, but you can listen to them on Dead Pilot Society, the podcast that brings you hilarious comedy pilots that the networks and streamers bought but never made. Journey to the alternate television universe of Dead Pilot Society on MaximumFun.org.
I think working in genre the way you have like that is interesting because so often your worlds exist out of place and time, or something made up completely out of whole cloth, like working with the Lost Lands. Like I physically can't go somewhere on Earth to find a place to shoot this movie, even if I would have gone to the ends of it if I could have located the right spot, kind of thing. That's an interesting thing about working in genre is you, in science fiction particularly, you get to work from a place of possibility, not bound necessarily, if you don't want to be, by the notions of norms that exist within cinema now. Whereas St. Elmo's Fire is a movie that is very defined by and a definitive, a portrait of the norms and customs of its time. Is that anything that, like, did you just not really have any much use for our ordinary day-to-day terrestrial setting when it came to the movies you were most interested in making?
I think I've always been fascinated with kind of world creation, and it's part of the filmmaking process that I really love, and I think it's why I've made the movies I've made. Because I've never done a movie where somebody's in a hotel room and then walks down the corridor and gets in a car and drives somewhere. Not once.
Yeah.
Shopping was probably as close as I got it. And even that was in a kind of Joel Schumacher kind of hyper reality. It was very much, it was in the real world, but in the same way that, Lost Boys and Flatliners is in the real world. So it's always been, and we had no money on that as well, which kind of limited the world creation. But since then, I've made these movies where you just you make everything, because people just aren't wearing regular, jeans and jackets and T-shirts, and they're not driving cars and they don't live in houses, so, and it's a lot more work, but I think it's part of movies. It's something that I really love, is that kind of world creation. And I think I've made movies that require that world creation, because quite often the environment ends up being a character in the movie and requires that kind of crafting.
Well, and I think an interesting thing to, again, with science fiction fantasy being sort of realms of utter possibility, if we allow it, if we invite that in. And I have a particularly acute interest in the evolution of the female action heroine. And Milla Jovovich plays a huge part in that history. And before it was de rigueur for an Oscar winner to be participating in an action franchise. But then with Resident Evil, what we see with Alice and with her we see the beginning of a decades-long run of somebody who becomes a defining tentpole figure in this genre. And again, in working in the realm of possibility, I'm not saying like you're sitting there splitting these hairs, but what it amounts to when you've had so many collaborations with your wife, putting in like her being at the front of these films and being so game for these like grand action landscapes is creating an icon of possibility herself for what women can and are allowed to do in genre cinema. Like, she has been integral to that. And as such have you throughout like the 21st century progression of the female action heroine.
I concur.
Good.
But it was interesting when I first came to Hollywood, there was this law, this unwritten rule. It wasn't written down, but people would articulate it, is like female-led action movies don't work.
Okay.
Because the belief was that the audience for action movies was male, and men want to see another male carrying the gun and being the hero, because otherwise they can't empathize with them. They can't imagine themselves in that guy's boots if that guy's boots are really nice, cute slippers, and she's wearing a skirt. And there'd been some notable failures as well, like Tank Girl had tanked. The remake of La Femme Nikita had not worked. But obviously, in Europe, these movies were working.
Yes.
There was a very vibrant there was no reason why a woman couldn't be in an action movie.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I came to America and I heard that, I'm like, I don't agree with this,
mm-hmm.
and I don't believe it. I think, if Tank Girl and Point of No Return didn't work, it's because they weren't great movies. They didn't, they could have worked, but they just didn't. And just because one adaptation of a book or a couple of adaptations of a book don't work, people don't throw their hands up and go, wow, you can never adapt a book. I felt like people need to keep trying. And, that's what we did. And, I've done for a lot of my career. And I think, we've proven that if you build it with a female action lead, people will come to the cinema. And not just in America, I think there was an audience more prone to come in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
But also it was very interesting on the very first Resident Evil movie, when we were doing a worldwide press tour for it, we kind of ended up in Japan. And most of the audience had been kind of heavily male around the world, in America, in Europe. You got to Japan and the audience was almost entirely young girls.
Interesting.
And the movie in Japan was seen as a female empowerment movie, because they just, at that time, the society was slightly different. And the idea of kind of seeing Milla really kick butt and take charge was something that, young women especially, loved. So, the audience for that film was very much driven by women in Japan.
Did the IP, did Resident Evil help that pitch stand on its own when you were getting that movie made? Or did it require cell work on your part for like, hey guys, here's why this action movie here in the States is going to do well with her on the poster, on the cover, being the girl, being Alice?
IP didn't have the value or the perceived value that it does now. When I first came to Hollywood and made Mortal Kombat, people were like very dismissive. They're like, ugh, a video, how can you even adapt a video game? How does that even work? It doesn't make any sense. And I'm like, well, clearly these people have never played the video game, because if they did, they know there's a story and there's characters.
Yeah.
But also there was even more than that. It was the idea of making something based on IP was really looked down upon. Making something based on something, it's like, ugh. That's not where the real creativity is. The real creativity at that time, perceived was in spec screenplays. Was Shane Black selling Lethal Weapon and Long Kiss Goodnight for records amounts of money.
Right.
It was all about original screenplays. And the Mortal Kombats of this world, and to some extent the Resident Evils, was definitely looked down upon. Now, how times have changed. Now, of course, you'd be better off kind of trying to base something based on this Sharpie and selling that than an original idea. Because at least there's a Sharpie, and how many Sharpies sell every year? A lot. So if we can make Sharpie the movie,
there's a lot of colors of Sharpie. That could be a hell of an animated movie.
Yeah. So now you have things that patently are not great ideas for movies, but studios are determined to turn them into films because it's IP. So to answer your question, it was the IP carried some weight, but not a huge amount. It was more, Milla was an attractive aspect of the movie. She'd done Fifth Element. She was a young movie star. She was probably a bigger draw than Resident Evil was. And you have to remember, Resident Evil was a movie that was financed entirely outside of North America. That movie had no American money in it. The movie was entirely paid for by European and Asian companies. And then when we released it in America, Sony just did a negative pickup of the film. And they had the rights to put it straight to DVD if they wanted, if the first test screening had not gone well. And then, of course, the movie made a ton of money, and then they regretted their deal because they were just doing a service deal. They weren't making any of the profits, which is why from then on, Sony pretty much released the movies worldwide. But they weren't actually... They actually didn't control the franchise, because the franchise was all originated outside of Europe. Because ultimately, that movie was a movie starring a Ukrainian, shot in Berlin, directed by an Englishman, based on a Japanese video game. So it actually wasn't even though the movies were all set in America, it wasn't inherently American.
Well, I guess the last thing I would ask you, like with the team up, the Megazord of you and Milla having persisted for so long now, what is it that is most exciting to you guys at this point? Like you said, she hit me over the back of the head with this and was like, we've got to do it. What are the kinds of things that are like, hit each other over the back of the head and be like, we've got to do this, knowing that it could take 7 years before it's going to be real, but you still want to put that time and legwork into bringing to life?
What she was really excited about, and me also, was from her point of view, she'd never done a fantasy film before. She'd done lots of genre cinema, never done a fantasy, never played a mystical figure, never played a witch. She's played extraordinary characters before, but quite often they're man-made. Mm-hmm. The Fifth Element, made by that machine. Resident Evil, Alice is, cloning, and the T-virus. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of kind of technological basis for the character she's made. And Milla's, as well as a big reader of fantasy, she is an avid reader of myth, Greek myth. Mm. And the idea of playing an oracle, a witch, was something that she'd never done before, and she saw as a big challenge. A timeless character who, their immense powers also make them immensely lonely. That was a very strong draw for her. Mm-hmm. And the same for me, to do a George R.R. Martin fantasy movie. Mm-hmm. I've made a lot of movies, but I haven't made a George R.R. Martin fantasy. And, when I read the short story, not only the basis of the story and the film is the relationship between Grey Alice and Boyce, between Milla and Dave Bautista, and they're great characters. But also there's the best twist I've read in a long, long time. I mean, it's great. It's classic George R.R. Martin. You get to the end of the story and you go, what? This is insane. And this is really happening. And of course, it's George. It's happening.
Yeah.
And that, or I always felt like if we translate that twist ending into a movie, mm-hmm. people are going to be talking about this thing. People, whether it's in the cinemas on opening weekend or whether it's kind of like a couple of years after the fact, mm-hmm. this movie is going to have a real life because this story is tremendous.
Well, I'm going to leave it at this story is tremendous and say that I hope if we get a Sharpie the movie one day, it includes a Paul W.S. Anderson orgy of violence, and that they don't just do it down the line.
Stabbing in people's eyes. In 3D.
So thank you so much for your time, Paul W.S. Anderson, one of the longest mainstays in my movie watching life, and it's just such a treat to get to talk to you.
Oh, fabulous. It was great talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much to Paul W.S. Anderson for taking the time to join us. In the Lost Lands is in theaters right now. Go straight to your local theater after this episode and watch it because, like Sean Baker announced at the Academy Awards, we all must do our part, mostly the studios, since they're the money people, but we all must do our part to preserve the theatrical experience, which is in jeopardy. So go to see your movies in theaters. But now I have that one quick thing before I go, and I think it's going to get kind of somber. But it's connected to, it is about the show that recently had its season finale drop on Hulu. It is called Paradise. It is from creator Dan Fogelman, of This Is Us fame, reuniting with Sterling K. Brown. And it's an apocalypse show, but kind of, a little different than you think. It's sort of like, recently binged The Silo, loved it. This feels like more in the sort of Silo vein of things. But we are in kind of like a, happy, joy, Pleasantville sort of bubble community that exists in the wake of civilization falling apart after, I'm not going to share what the disaster-y things happening are, because you learn that over the course of the show. And I'm going to be spoilery, but I'm still going to be careful. So, world's ended, guys, in some way, shape, or form. World's ended. And we are in Paradise, which is trying to perpetuate civilization with a couple dozens of thousands of people carrying on the last flame of humanity. There is an episode. It's further in. I think it's episode 7. It's called The Day. And we learn how the world came to an end in the show's, it mixes up, it splices its timelines together. So we go back and forth piecing together what really happened. As we exist in our, the present timeline of the show, where there is like political intrigue and, mysterious murders for reasons we don't know who did them, why did they do them, etc. But I gotta say, on the episode today, when we learn how everything came crashing down, I'm going to be a little bit vague while also being spoilery. It hit so hard to watch something that felt really one of those things that felt really hauntingly realistic in its depiction of how it would all fall apart, how it would all collapse, and things are on the verge of feeling like they're going to constantly fall apart and collapse at this current moment, and we feel like we're on the edge of the end of the world. And this show feels like it arrives at like 30 seconds to midnight, and it is the stroke of midnight. And when it all comes down, when basically, we go past the event horizon. We go past the point of no return. The world's going to end. And we know how that ends up because that's how the show starts. We see where we are in this town of, this paradise under a dome. But a person in power, I won't say who, a person in power is on the list of people to go to the haven to perpetuate humanity, to survive. And this person in power works in a place where, there are service workers around. And this person in power keeps noticing as this tragedy is unfolding, this epic, catastrophic, civilization-ending thing is happening. And he keeps looking at this service worker in his office. And he's getting distracted. You feel like, oh, he knows that this person's going to die. Like, this person in power is going to be safe. And he's looking at this person who works to keep his place, his space safe and clean. And he walks up to him. And he's like, he basically is like, hey, man, shakes his hand, introduces himself. And he's like, maybe you should go be with your family. Because it's clear things are falling apart at this point. But he's still not being the guy in power who knows what's up. He's not really being totally specific. But he's like telling this service worker, like, you should go be with your people you love. And the guy, older gentleman, been around for a long time, worked at this place forever, amidst many bosses. And he tells him, he's like, it'll be okay. I'm seeing them tomorrow for like my granddaughter's birthday. And the guy in charge is like, yeah, you should, but I think you should, I don't think now is the time for this. Like, you don't worry about cleaning anymore. Like that it's all happening. Like, this is it, man. And the older guy tells him, he's like, the good thing about being my age is you've seen it all before. And the guy in charge is like, yeah, well, this time's different. And the older guy is like, I've heard that before too. And it just like watching someone people catastrophize and they talk about how the world, everything's coming to an end, world's ending, and like there's a numbing effect to that. And even when you take it really seriously and it scares you, like, there's still a numbing effect. Like, you get used to the routine of saying that things are so bad, things are so bad, things are going to end. This is the end of the world. You get so used to saying it that even if you're taking it seriously, like, I feel like it still dulls. And this, like, watching this guy who knows exactly what's happening say to this man who will not be saved, who will not live, like, it's different this time. And having the guy look back at him, guy who doesn't know, and being like, yeah, I've heard that before too, felt so real. It felt so much like watching people scream into the void, warnings and cautions and alerts and everything and nobody could say they didn't know, and just everything they can do to try and stem the tide of what's happening. And, the nice, well-meaning person is just like, yeah, I mean, I've heard that all before too. I've seen it all before. It's not, things always turn out okay. And this guy in charge knows that this time nothing will be okay. Everything is ending. Everything is bad. This is it. It's over. It's over. The world experiment is over. And that, oh my God, like, watching the episode, so incredibly well done. The build up to it throughout the season, in the way that it teases and teases until this final episode of, like, payoff, was so intense and scary and stark, and just, like, for, like, a catastrophic, like, for, like, a, globe world ending scenario, so grounded. It felt like watching a glimpse into the future. And it was great television, and it felt uniquely upsetting in how much I feel like, I guess, we've come to internalize and probably project what the end of the world, how it would go down at a sociological level. And, like, we're so practiced in this and marinated in it at this point that, like, Dan Fogelman and his writers were like, well, wait, we have a pretty good sense of how this is going to go. We know exactly what it's going to feel like. And I think they're uncomfortably close to correct, if not dead on. So, yeah. Tune into Paradise if you want to feel all of that. Like I said, great television, incredibly affecting. On Hulu, whole first season is available now. That's the show. That's what I'm going to send you guys out on. Really apologize, but that's what I'm going to send you out on. You can keep up with us for more of these happy insights wherever you get your podcasts. Do follow wherever you are listening to get every new episode in your feed. You can follow us on Instagram at Feeling Seen Pod. We are also on Blue Sky, me and the show. Search Feeling Seen or JORCRU. Jor Crew, that's me, Twitter and Blue Sky. Our theme music is by Andrew Epen. This show is produced by Daniel Quasius. Our senior producers are Kevin Ferguson and Laura Swisher, and this is a production of Maximum Fun.
Maximum Fun,
a worker-owned network
of artist-owned shows.
Supported directly by you.